so we're going to make this a little bit different to some of the previous presentations. My name's Paul Thurston, and this is Anna Witcher, and you've got some questions.
Yeah, right. So I'm really delighted that so many of you have stayed to the end. And so I want a little public opinion poll on the types of people who have actually stayed in the room this evening. So if you could all please stand up. Hopefully I won't annoy the security guards again by getting everybody up. Right. I'd like to see how many of the people in the room who have stayed are designers. So if you're not a designer, please sit down. So only designers remain standing. Good commitment by the designers, thank you. Yeah, okay, if you'd all like to stand up again, please. Now I'd like to see how many of the government officials have stayed to the end. So if you're not a government official, please sit down. Oh, that tells a lot. Thank you very much to those of you who stayed. And if you would all stand up one last time, please. I'd like to find out who from industry has stayed to the end. So who works in a private business? So if you don't work in a private business, please sit down. And the designers can sit down if you're not embedded in broader industry. Brilliant. Okay, so people performing dual roles. That's great. Would you like to take a seat? Thank you again for staying to the end.
Okay, so I think it's really exciting that we're here sort of on the last slot to sort of give you a bit of our thoughts about what's happening next. So our talk is called Service Design in Policy Trends 2015 to 2020. So it's really exciting to see as about 5 people from the public sector have stayed. So this is for you guys. So my name's Paul Thurston. I'm head of service design at PDR. PDR is an organisation. Some of you came to our conference in Cardiff 2 years ago. And if you did, it's really nice to see you again. And this is my colleague Anna Witcher, and she leads all of our innovation policy work. And we've heard a lot at the conference about why service design. We've heard lots of people speak about why we should be doing it, why governments, why businesses should be doing it. And what we're going to talk about is what next. So what should service design be doing next? And this is a question that came up, and Jamid asked it actually, and I don't think the panel answered it really. So hopefully we're going to plug that gap and give you a bit of thought about where we see service design going next, particularly within the context of policy. So I mentioned we're from an organisation called PDR. We're an International Centre for Design and Research, and effectively we focus on user-centred design across 8 different areas. And these range from innovation policy, obviously, and service design, but also things like advanced manufacture, through to design management, to product design. There's a very, very broad range of stuff. We do things around digital product development, and we also do things with skulls. So we're very well known for our work in the medical industry. We have service contracts with the healthcare sector. And the reason we put this in is because this was a project which we identified maybe 15, 20 years ago, that actually using product design technologies for the healthcare sector could potentially be quite useful. So we've been doing 3D printed implants, skulls, body parts for prosthesis for around 15 years now. And I'm sure you're all aware of kind of the current trend in that area and the amount of stories that are coming out now. So we'll probably stop doing this now and start looking at what's next in that sector. And I think that's kind of where we're at today, really, in terms of where service design is going next. Cameron mentioned there were a few things missing from the conference, and I think kind of a bit of future visioning is in order. That said, if it doesn't all turn out as we say it will, then we'll just go and hide for a few years, I think.
What we'd like to do is come back in 5 years' time, with our trends that have come to the fore and give you a review of what has been happening. But the real focus of our presentation today is on design in government. So there are 2 things that we'd like to differentiate between, and that is designing services and designing policy. And in terms of designing policy, I think there are 2 trends that we're seeing. We're seeing that design is being adopted as a methodology for user-centred policymaking for open government. And this is really fantastic. And we've seen so many case studies today from a really broad variety of different government departments. But what we haven't seen are any elected officials using design methods for legislative purposes. And I think this is something that we're going to be seeing a lot more of in the future.
I think when you look at the programme, well, so used to having it there. When you look at the programme and you see who is on the agenda, and you start to look into it, I just had a look, and it's 28% of presentations are from government officials, employees of government. I think that's pretty amazing. 30%, they've all gone home, but it's almost 30% are delivering content to the service design network. And I think when you look back at some of the programme from maybe 5-6 years ago, that definitely wouldn't have been the case. But within that, there's a really interesting bit, and that's that 12% of those presentations are specifically looking at the use of design within policy, to formulate policy. And I think Camilla's presentation earlier really kind of showed how that's happening in the UK, but I think it's not just in the UK. And we want to share a bit of our thoughts around that.
Absolutely. And although the trends that we're going to be presenting in a minute do draw on a lot of the stuff that's happening in Europe, what we really want to emphasize is this is a global phenomenon. Not only is design being integrated as a competence within policy, so design as an enabler of innovation policy, design as an enabler of open healthcare policy, but design is also being used as a methodology for inclusive, transparent policy making. And we developed some case studies of countries around the world who are doing both sides of this. And there's something that I'd like to really highlight is that I think that the European Commission is one of these front runners in recognizing the breadth of design application. And they developed in 2013 a dedicated design strategy where they've recognized that design is not only transformative for products and services in the private sector, but also increasingly, as we've found out over the last 2 days, in terms of the public sector. But crucially, in terms of inclusive policy making, we're all aware there's a crisis in government, that there's low voter turnout in elections. People are disenfranchised with the political systems. And I believe that design really is a process, a methodology that we can use to engage with the political system again. We have some amazing statistics that have come out in Europe on companies' use of design. I'm sure that you're all aware of the Danish Design Ladder, which categorizes companies' use of design according to 4 stages. 1, no use of design. 2, design as styling and aesthetics. 3, design as process in the product or service development process. And 4, design as strategy, so really part of the ethos and the philosophy of the company. And we have, for the first time, pan-European data across the 28 EU member states on how companies use design. I think it's intriguing that 55% of companies don't use design, but that also means that almost half of companies are using design, which is fantastic. 14% of companies use design as styling, 18% use design as process, and I'm really encouraged that 13% of companies perceive that they use design as strategy within their business. This is the survey that Christian Besson referred to yesterday, in which Greece scored really highly. I'd like to stand up for the Greeks and just say that in the survey, when you translate design into Greek, the word is actually very similar to planning, so there's a little bit of linguistic confusion, which is perhaps why the results were skewed slightly. Not that you wouldn't expect Greek companies to be innovative, but obviously in the current climate. They also did a similar survey in the US, and I think it's really interesting to compare the results of Europe and the US. According to the findings, 63% of US firms don't use design, compared with, for example, 8% who use design and styling. But if you look right at the top, companies that are using design strategically, EU, US, pretty similar.
You can see there the Europeans are much more stylish as well, which is give it information. I'll hide.
So, for the last 3 years, I've been running a European project that was funded by the European Commission to raise awareness of what design can achieve for policy. We did a lot of advocacy work, we did research, but we also crucially did hands-on workshops with government officials. design is a very complex process, and it can be a very complex concept for policymakers to grasp without examples. So rather than try to tell policymakers what design is, we wanted to show them. We involved them in over 115 workshops using service design methods for policymaking. And there are over 1,000 civil servants involved in these workshops. One of the tools that I used was looking at the design innovation ecosystem. So the players, the actors, the strengths and the weaknesses that are contributing to design-driven innovation in a country. And what we'd like to do with you today is just to present a few trends on these various 9 components of the design innovation ecosystem.
So as Anna said, we've been running a number of European projects, which I think in total we've got around 20 partners from all across Europe. And by partners, they range from people like the UK Design Council to much smaller design bodies out in Eastern Europe. And these trends that we've put together, I think, are things that we've seen based on bits of evidence that we've seen as well. And I think when we've been sat here watching all the presentations, we've been a bit nervous because we've been waiting till the end to show you these, and we were just really worried someone might go, you know what, none of this matters, and it's all. But actually, there's a lot of evidence based on the presentations here that actually really back up a lot of what we're going to say. So hopefully you enjoy listening to some of these and have a think about what it means to you. And I think particularly for our Asian and South American and US colleagues here, this is obviously quite European focused. We're both from the UK. This is a European project we've been working on and based on. So we'd really like to have a chat with you afterwards, see if there's any differences between the different regions. So trend number 1, and I think this is a really important one, but these aren't in any particular order. They're in the order of the design ecosystem tool that Anna mentioned. So we're talking about users, and I think in the context of this, we're talking about government users. So our trend here is agile procurement will become the norm. And I think governments are very good at buying big things. It's very easy for a government to buy a franchise for a rail. It's very easy for people to buy construction projects. Buying quite fluffy service design projects is a bit different. I think it's some really good examples of the way that governments are starting to change the policies that they have in place around procurement. And I think one of the examples is with the government digital service. And I know that they've been mentioned quite a few times here, but they're doing some really interesting work about their way that they design their contracts. So applying service design principles to the design of their contracts and moving from 800-page documents to 200-page documents. It seems, when you say it like that, it doesn't sound brilliant, but it's that kind of change. Actually being much better at procuring agile development is really, really key. And I think we're going to start to see more and more of that because that's the biggest lever that public sector has is procurement. I think we're also going to see, so trend number 2 is around support. So business support programs are a mechanism that governments use to either improve business outputs through design or whether it's improve the design culture within a region or nation. And I think what we've started to see is much more specialized support programs. In the past, they've been very, very broad. They've tended to focus on the masses and be applicable to any business that comes into contact with government. So things like grants for small businesses and that type of thing fit into this kind of category. And that could be whether you're a sort of a laundrette or whether you're a design business. But what we're starting to see is much more specialized ones. So we've been working for the last 3 years on a contract with the Welsh Government, looking at how manufacturing companies are using service design. And there's some really good examples of companies that we work with. 2 in particular are now the 2 highest growth companies in Wales because of the changes they've made to their business models based on the service design principles that were put into them early on.
Another key trend number 3, is design promotion being seen as a strategic investment. Governments actually invest quite a lot of money in Europe in promoting design. They tend to be focused on quite traditional approaches such as design awards, exhibitions, trade missions, which are fantastic and we still need them. But I think what is amazing is the investment that governments are now making in design promotion at a really great level. For example, the Finnish government invested 17 million euros in Helsinki World Design Capital in 2012. I think that is an enormous investment, an unprecedented investment in promoting the awareness and building capacity for design through a year-long campaign focused on both the private and public sectors. And as a result, they estimated that tourism to Helsinki increased by 3%.
I think the other thing we're starting to see throughout this conference is this thirst for knowledge. So the actors within this ecosystem, Anna mentioned about the number of civil servants that have been trained through our programs. And I think there's a lot of talk from Nick Leon yesterday about training for design, from Camilla this afternoon, from Chelsea yesterday. And I think actually, whilst government staff are getting engaged in design and they're receiving kind of awareness-raising training, they're understanding the methods and things like that, actually I think we need to be doing a bit more for them. And actually people are asking about accredited training, looking at master's courses, and I think there are things springing up, but I think the demand is going to be much greater than we anticipate. And I think we're going to see a huge rise in the number of specialised design courses for government services. And so we run an accredited training program. We've seen a huge amount of growth in terms of interest in that. But again, it's a very small program. We have limited capacity. And I think one of the things that would be good to debate about with some of the other universities is ways that we can work better. And I think over the next 5 years, we're going to see more of that.
Trend number 5, which really is for me the most exciting one, is this rise of design methods in policymaking. And I alluded to it earlier. I think we're seeing a lot of ministries, government departments, the civil service using design for policymaking, which is fantastic. But I don't think, or certainly not in the sessions that I went to, were there any examples of design being used in the legislature. And actually, we did a very short project over the summer working with an MP to raise awareness of a very specific issue. There was a very, very controversial bill in the UK in September. It was called the Assisted Dying Bill. So it's essentially looked at whether euthanasia should be legalised in the UK like it is in Switzerland. Legislation like that is so controversial, and very often politicians have to make decisions and vote along party lines, despite perhaps their own personal views. And I think very often this was an example of a very, very contentious issue that wasn't particularly discussed in the media in the UK, and it wasn't really, there was no kind of symbiotic engagement between citizens and politicians on this particular subject. So we ran a very short pilot project, which was very exploratory, which involved using service design methods with a group of older people to examine what they felt their perspectives on this new legislation would be. And what we did with them, we wanted to develop a design provocation. And we worked with them, and in the end, we actually developed a euthanasia wearable. Don't worry, it was totally fictitious. But we heard earlier about more of these wearables, and it was obviously not ever intended to be a working prototype, but it was supposed to be a provocation to enable debate between citizens and politicians. And using this prop, using this provocation, the debate between the older people, the carers, some healthcare workers, was really, really lively. And as you can imagine, a topic like this involves so much empathy. I think that we have such an amazing opportunity to use service design methods in this political decision-making, in political agenda setting. And I'd love to see more of these projects in the future. So if anybody's doing any work in this area, please do let us know. As I mentioned, I'm also looking at the role of design in innovation policy. So how design can enable small companies, everything from micro enterprises through to multinationals, to be more innovative and respond better to customer needs. And to do this, we've been engaging with government to see how they can better support, develop better innovation policies using design. So we developed a series of workshops using hands-on service design methods to develop innovation policy. So that is policy for design through design. Oh, it's me again. Sorry. Trend number 9 is the rise of design in innovation funding programs. I think a massive difference I've noticed between the EU and the US is the amount of government support that's available to small companies. You can access everything from innovation vouchers, grants, subsidies, tax credits, training, mentoring, the whole works. And I think in the past, design has been part of these funding programs, been part of these innovation programs, but it's always been a very small subsection, and take-up has been very low among companies. But now design is being integrated into these mainstream innovation programs, which means that for the first time, companies who would never have taken the risk to use design for the first time are now receiving mentoring and financial grants to invest in design for the first time.
So an example of that is a project that kicked off just before we came out here with a company called River Simple. So they design and manufacture hydrogen cars, and they've received some R&D funding for the technology side of their business. But previously, they would never have been able to access support for service design or for business model design. And now that is something that is a viable cost that can be awarded in funding and grant aid in Europe.
Trend number 7 is a real increase in investment in design research by government. And I think this is not design research for design research's sake. This is creating a bank of evidence which demonstrates the impact of design in different domains, in different sectors. And I think what's really interesting is that the UK Research Council for Arts and Humanities invested £6 million in design research alone. They have made design research their flagship investment priority for the next 4 years, which is absolutely phenomenal. And I think this is something we're going to see increasingly across other research councils in Europe, is greater investment in design research.
So trend number 8, we're talking about education, and I think we've heard about it quite a lot actually, this skills gap, and I know that the Carnegie Mellon presentation recently was talking about that. I think what we're going to see though is job specifications changing. We're going to start to see public officials having design skills written into their job spec. And if you don't believe me, well, there's 2 contracts that have come out recently which evidence this. So this one on the left here is with the UK Cabinet Office. This is, for all the service design training consultancies out there, this is a contract that's coming out next month. So if you're interested, have a look into it. Basically, Capita lost this contract, and it's now being put out in much smaller chunks. And I mentioned before about agile procurement, that's being applied here. What they're doing though, what's really interesting within this is one of the KPIs within it is 10,000 civil servants trained in user-centered design. So you imagine 10,000 civil servants within the UK public sector, that's absolutely huge. And this is a training, leadership, executive level leadership program. So you think the impact that's going to have. On the right here, at a European level, the European Commission have just had a bid out, a call for tenders for their new EU policy lab. And the tender stipulates they want design services to train them in using design methods. And when you think about the number of people within that organisation and the amount of organisations they touch, the impact that's going to have is absolutely huge. And so there's these small discrete projects going on. There's these big contracts being put out. But actually, the easiest way for government to start changing the culture is through their recruitment policies of new staff. And I think that's what we're going to see over the next 5 years. The other thing that we will start to see as well is, I suppose this is a bit of a spin on the acquisition trend at the moment. So small boutique service design agencies being bought out by management consultancies. We believe that we will actually see a government service spin out. So there are huge numbers of innovation teams, service design teams being built within government. And within the next 5 years, we believe that some of those will eventually spin out as private businesses. There are precedents for that, and in the UK, we look to things like the Royal Mint. So the Royal Mint makes all of the coinage in the UK, and in the 1980s, and up until the 1980s, it was owned by the UK government as an in-house business, and in the 1980s, it turned it out and spun it out as a government-owned business, and it still is today. It actually makes 80% of the world's coinage, and it's just based up the road from us in Cardiff. And I think we're going to start to see, probably not at the same kind of scale as that, but when you look at some of the teams within governments, the Government Digital Service employs 200 staff. 200 staff. If they spin out, they're going to become one of the biggest design agencies in the world. So I think this is something that we will, I suppose I'm going to put my flag in the ground and say I think we will see this within the next 5 years. And maybe not with the Government Digital Service, but I think it will happen. So they're the trends that we're seeing, the 9 trends. And like I say before, these are things that we've seen through our projects and programs at a European level. We'd like to hear from some of our counterparts in Asia, the US, and other parts of the world about your thoughts on this, because we mentioned some of the cultural differences there. But we see this as a kind of a starting point for discussion and thinking about what's going to happen next, how this might apply to your work, how it might apply to your businesses, how it might apply to the way that you work in the future. So after this session, we're obviously going to go out and have a drink and stuff, and we'd really like to talk to you, particularly... What's funny about that? Of course we go for a drink. We'd really like to talk to you if you're interested in using design to formulate policy, setting up a design or innovation program, developing a design-led innovation lab, or you're looking to build capacity. We'd like to talk to you if you're not doing any of those things as well, but particularly if you're doing those kind of things. So thank you very much for your time and your patience to let us share some of those trends, things that we really believe are going to be happening over the next 5 years. And thank you very much for a wonderful conference as well, for all the organisers.
Thanks.
Thank you.